There was once a day when the fate of Western civilization hung in the balance, carried upon the restless waves of the Mediterranean. A day when the most powerful empire in the known world sent forth its seemingly invincible fleet to crush Christian resistance forever. A day when a single revolutionary weapon would change the face of naval warfare for centuries to come. This was the day of the Battle of Lepanto, October 7th, 1571, and the secret weapon that determined the fate of millions. To truly grasp what unfolded on that fateful morning in the Gulf of Patras, one must go back several decades and witness a world on the brink of collapse. The 16th century was an age of empires colliding, of wars that redrew borders, reshaped faiths, and redirected the course of history itself. At its center stood the Ottoman Empire, under Sultan Selim II, the most feared power in existence. After the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, the Ottomans had ended 1,000 years of Byzantine rule and unleashed an era of unstoppable expansion. They swept across Eastern Europe, crushed Hungary, besieged Vienna, dominated North Africa, and transformed the Mediterranean into what many now call the Turkish Lake. Their fleet embodied the might of the empire. Ottoman galleys, long, narrow, and propelled by oars, glided swiftly across the water. Each carried hundreds of rowers, many of them Christian slaves chained to their benches, condemned to the rhythmic torment of the oars. Above them, the fearsome janissaries, elite soldiers of the Sultan, stood ready for the brutal hand-to-hand combat that defined Mediterranean warfare. The Ottoman strategy was terrifyingly simple. Their ships surged forward, bronze rams piercing enemy hulls, grappling hooks locking vessels together, and then chaos erupted. Janissaries poured across the decks, scimitars flashing, arquebuses firing, until resistance was drowned in blood. Few opponents had ever survived such an assault. Yet the empire's strength was not only in its warriors, but in its organization. From the shipyards of Istanbul to the harbors of Alexandria, the Ottoman war machine functioned with ruthless efficiency. Galleys could be built in days, and the empire's wealth from Asia and Africa fueled endless campaigns. Sultan Selim, too, may not have possessed his father Suleiman's genius, but he inherited a juggernaut built to conquer. Across the sea, Christian Europe stood fractured and fearful. The Protestant Reformation had split Christendom into warring camps. France, though Catholic, formed cynical alliances with the Ottomans to undermine Spain. England turned inward, distracted by its own power struggles. Only a few powers saw the Ottoman threat for what it truly was. Spain, under King Philip II, recognized that the Mediterranean itself was at stake. Venice, the glittering merchant republic, saw its trade routes strangled by Ottoman dominance. And Pope Pius V, a man of relentless faith and vision, feared that if the Ottomans were not stopped, Rome itself would one day fall. The spark that ignited the coming storm was the fall of Cyprus. After a grueling siege, the island surrendered in 1571. The Venetian commander, Marco Antonio Bragadin, was promised mercy, but instead he was tortured and flayed alive, his skin stuffed with straw and displayed in triumph in Istanbul. That act of horror sent shockwaves through Europe. Pope Pius seized the moment. Through tireless diplomacy and divine conviction, he forged an alliance between bitter rivals. Venice sought vengeance, Spain offered ships and silver, and the Papal States promised spiritual unity. Thus was born the Holy League, a coalition sworn to halt Ottoman expansion. At its head stood a man barely 24 years old, Don Juan of Austria, the illegitimate son of Emperor Charles V and half-brother of King Philip II. Young, ambitious, and adored by his men, Don Juan had already proven himself in Granada, crushing rebellion with both courage and tactical brilliance. Charismatic and daring, he dreamed of liberating Constantinople itself, but his first test would come at sea. Throughout the summer of 1571, ships from across Europe gathered in the port of Messina. Spanish galleons, Venetian galleys, papal vessels, and Maltese warships formed one of the greatest fleets ever assembled. Among them were 6 strange, experimental ships, the Venetian galleasses. Larger, higher, and bristling with artillery, they were unlike anything the Mediterranean had ever seen. For centuries, naval battles have been decided by boarding and hand-to-hand fighting. Cannons were used only to weaken the enemy before ramming began. But the galleasses introduced a new philosophy: destroy from afar. Packed with heavy guns on all sides, they could unleash storms of fire long before enemies came close. Many commanders doubted them. They were slow, cumbersome, and dependent on wind. Some called them floating fortresses doomed to fail. But Don Juan saw their potential. He realized that while they could not chase the enemy, they could anchor the line, immovable bastions that would shatter any galley daring to approach. His decision to deploy them at the front of his formation would change everything. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, the Ottoman fleet gathered under the command of Muezzin Zaid Ali Pasha. Nearly 300 galleys, seasoned crews, relentless warriors, and an air of absolute confidence. They had crushed every European fleet for decades. Many among them boasted openly of the cities they would soon plunder in Italy once victory was achieved. In September, the Holy League set sail from Messina, over 200 ships gliding eastward under bright banners and golden crosses. Among the 80,000 men aboard was a young Spanish soldier named Miguel de Cervantes, who would one day write Don Quixote. Though sick with fever, he refused to stay below deck. He would be wounded 3 times in the battle, losing the use of his left hand, but surviving to tell the tale of that unforgettable day. For weeks, the fleet searched for the Ottomans. Tension grew, rumors spread, and then, on the morning of October 7th, lookouts cried out, sails on the horizon. The enemy had been found. As dawn broke over the Gulf of Patras, 2 mighty fleets faced each other. To the north, mist rolled down the Greek mountains. The sea lay calm, the air thick with anticipation. Don Juan called his commanders for one last council. Venice demanded vengeance. Spain urged caution. He listened, then gave his final orders. The Christian fleet stretched across the water 3 miles wide. Don Juan took the center aboard the reel, his royal galley draped in red and gold. Giovanni Andrea Doria commanded the right wing, and Agostino Barbarigo the left. Ahead of them, Don Juan placed his secret weapon, the 6 Venetian galleasses, positioned like sentinels at the front of each division. Their task was simple yet vital: to break the Ottoman charge before it could reach the main line. If they failed, the Christian fleet would be swallowed whole. If they succeeded, they could turn the tide of history. The stage was set for one of the greatest naval battles the world had ever seen, a clash that would decide not just the control of the Mediterranean, but the very future of civilization itself. On the Ottoman side, Ali Pasha divided his massive fleet into 3 powerful formations. He commanded overwhelming numbers, nearly 300 ships against barely 28 Christian vessels. His plan was rooted in centuries of proven Ottoman naval tradition: advance swiftly, use sheer numbers to encircle the Christian flanks, and then crush their center in a deadly pincer movement. It was a tactic that had brought ruin to countless Christian fleets before. Commanding the Ottoman right wing was Mehmed Sirako, a seasoned warrior who knew every current and island of the Greek seas. On the left stood Ulik Ali, a man with one of the most remarkable stories in Mediterranean history, an Italian fisherman captured by Barbary pirates, who converted to Islam and rose through the ranks to become one of the most feared corsairs of his time. Ruthless, cunning, and supremely skilled, Ulik Ali was a commander who inspired both fear and admiration. By noon, both fleets faced each other, motionless across the Gulf of Patras. The air was thick with tension. This was far more than a battle for dominance at sea. It was a confrontation between 2 worlds, 2 faiths, and two visions of civilization. Both sides believed they fought for their very existence. On the Christian side, Don Juan of Austria, commander of the Holy League, ordered a massive crucifix to be raised upon his flagship. Then, in a small boat, he rowed along his fleet, speaking personally to his commanders and soldiers, reminding them what was at stake: their homes, their families, their faith. To his men, he said they fought not for wealth or glory, but for survival. Across the waves, Ali Pasha gave his own speech. He urged his warriors to remember their past victories, to recall the disunity of their enemies, and to trust in destiny. The janissaries, the elite soldiers of the Sultan, pounded their shields in unison, a thunderous rhythm that rolled across the sea like an omen. At around 12:30, the silence broke. The Ottoman fleet surged forward, hundreds of oars cutting through the water in perfect harmony. It was a terrifying spectacle, a vast, living organism of wood, steel, and human determination. Drums thundered, rowers chanted. The air trembled with the sound of hundreds of ships advancing as one. The Christian line held still, waiting. The suspense was unbearable. Men prayed. Priests moved among them, granting final absolution. Commanders checked their weapons again and again, knowing what was about to come. Then, when the Ottoman vanguard came within range, about 1,000 meters, the Venetian galleasses unleashed their fury. The explosion of cannon fire shattered the calm sea. Heavy iron shot tore through the air, smashing into the leading Ottoman galleys. The devastation was immediate and horrifying. Cannonballs ripped through hulls and human bodies alike, splintering wood into deadly shards and turning packed decks into scenes of chaos. Within minutes, the front line of the Ottoman fleet was in disarray, ships burning or sinking under the relentless bombardment. The Ottoman advance faltered, confusion spreading as captains struggled to control their ships. But centuries of discipline held. The galleys pressed forward, desperate to close the distance before the Christians could reload. Soon, dozens broke through and slammed into the Holy League's line. The battle erupted into brutal close combat. The sea became a storm of splintered wood, fire, and blood. Ships collided, grappling hooks locked hulls together, and men leapt from deck to deck. In the very center, Don Juan's flagship clashed directly with that of Ali Pasha. It was as if fate itself demanded their duel. On the royal galleys, chaos reigned. Ottoman janissaries, the empire's finest, fought face-to-face with the Spanish tercios, Europe's most feared infantry. Arquebuses roared, swords and scimitars clashed, and men died where they stood. Don Juan himself fought among them, his sword drenched in blood as he urged his men forward. For 3 grueling hours, the battle swayed back and forth. The Ottomans briefly gained control of Don Juan's forecastle, and for a moment, it seemed the Christian commander might be captured. But reinforcements arrived from neighboring galleys, and the Christians counterattacked, driving their enemies back. Arquebusiers fired down from the turrets, mowing down the crowded decks below. On the northern flank, Venetian commander Agostino Barbarigo fought Mem Sirocco with unmatched fury. Remembering the horrors of Cyprus, his men fought like avengers. Even after an arrow pierced Barbarigo's eye, he refused to leave his deck, bleeding as he continued to command. Gradually, the Venetian wing gained the upper hand, forcing Sirocco's galleys into retreat. But on the southern wing, Ulik Ali saw opportunity. Recognizing the failure of the frontal assault, he executed a brilliant flanking maneuver, sweeping around the Christian line to attack from the side. Giovanni Andrea Doria, commanding the southern Christians, was forced to extend his formation, creating dangerous gaps. Ulik Ali exploited them mercilessly, breaking through, seizing the flagship of the Knights of Malta, and tearing down their sacred banner. For a terrifying moment, the entire Christian line seemed ready to collapse. Then Don Juan made his decisive move. Holding a reserve of powerful galleys, he ordered them forward under the command of Alvaro de Bazan. the Marquis of Santa Cruz. The counterattack was ferocious. The reserve smashed into Ulik Ali's force, driving it back and restoring the line. In the center, the battle reached its turning point. Ali Pasha, still fighting on the deck of his ship, was struck by an arquebus bullet and fell mortally wounded. His death sent shockwaves through the Ottoman ranks. His head was raised on a spear, and the sight broke the morale of his men. The Sultan's banner, once proud upon his galley, was torn down and replaced by that of the Holy League. The Christians roared in triumph as the Ottoman formation began to crumble. From there, the battle turned into a rout. Ottoman ships tried to flee but found no escape. The bay was enclosed, and the Christians blocked the exit. It was no longer a battle, but a slaughter. The sea was filled with wreckage, bodies, and men crying out for mercy. By late afternoon, it was over. Of nearly 300 Ottoman galleys, more than 200 were destroyed or captured. 30,000 men were dead, 8,000 taken prisoner, and 15,000 Christian slaves were freed from the oars they had rowed for years. As the sun set over the Gulf of Patras, the waters glowed red with the reflection of blood and fire. Don Juan moved among the survivors, comforting the wounded and offering prayers for the dead. He understood that this was no ordinary victory, it was the end of an era. The secret to this triumph lay in innovation. The Venetian galleasses, massive, artillery-heavy ships, had changed the face of naval warfare forever. For centuries, sea battles have been fought as land battles upon the water, with soldiers boarding ships to fight hand-to-hand. But at Lepanto, the cannon had become the true master of the sea. The ships themselves, with their devastating firepower, were now the decisive weapon. This transformation had been years in the making. The Venetians had perfected the galleass through experimentation and ingenuity, creating ships that required fewer rowers but many more trained gunners. These new sailors needed to understand not just courage, but physics, range, trajectory, and reload timing. It was a revolution in both technology and doctrine. The Ottomans, bound by centuries of tradition, had been slower to adapt. Their confidence in time-tested tactics proved fatal. And so, in one afternoon, the myth of Ottoman naval invincibility was shattered. When news of a victory reached Europe, celebration swept the continent. Bells rang in every city. Processions filled the streets. Pope Pius V fell to his knees in gratitude and declared October 7th the Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary. In Venice, fireworks lit the night sky, and wine flowed through the squares as the people rejoiced. The Battle of Lepanto had not just saved Christendom, it had changed the course of naval warfare forever. Don Juan of Austria had become Europe's most celebrated hero almost overnight. At just 24 years old, he had commanded the greatest naval victory of the century. Poets sang his name, artists immortalized his image, and women across Christendom admired the young and handsome commander who had humbled the might of the Ottoman fleet. For a moment, it seemed as though destiny had chosen him for even greater things, perhaps even the long-dreamed conquest of Constantinople itself. But history, as it often does, took a different turn. The Holy League, painstakingly united before the battle, began to crumble soon after its triumph. Old rivalries between Venice and Spain resurfaced. Each power pursued its own interests. Venice, weary from war and desperate to restore its trade, made peace with the Ottomans. Spain, distracted by rebellion in the Netherlands and growing tension with England, shifted its focus elsewhere. Don Juan's moment of glory faded. Instead of leading another crusade, he was sent to govern the Spanish Netherlands, a land torn by endless revolt. There, far from the Mediterranean sun and the glory of Lepanto, he died in 1578 at the age of 33, stricken by typhoid fever in a cold military tent. His body was secretly returned to Spain, dismembered and salted to survive the journey. A tragic end for a man who had once embodied the hopes of Christendom. Meanwhile, the Ottomans proved astonishingly resilient. Their Grand Vizier famously remarked, "You Christians have burned our beard, but it will grow back stronger. We have cut off your arm, and it will never grow back." He meant Cyprus, which the Ottomans retained despite their defeat. And indeed, within a year, the shipyards of Istanbul had built a new fleet of more than 200 galleys. Yet, even though they had replaced their ships, something far deeper had changed. The aura of Ottoman invincibility was gone. For the first time in generations, it had been shown that they could be defeated, that their tactics could be broken, and that their empire was not the unstoppable force so many had believed. This shift in psychology was perhaps as significant as the victory itself. Christian Europe regained its confidence. The fear that had haunted its coasts began to fade. Lepanto marked the end of Ottoman expansion in the Western Mediterranean. They would remain powerful, but they would never again threaten Italy or the heart of Europe. As for the galleasses, the secret weapon of Lepanto, they represented the dawn of a new age in naval warfare. These massive hybrid ships, armed with rows of cannons, were far more powerful than the old galleys. But they were also a transitional form, too costly, too complex, and still partially dependent on oars. They were a glimpse of the future, one that would not fully arrive until the age of the great sailing warships, when fleets would battle in long, parallel lines of cannon fire, a tactic that Nelson would later perfect at Trafalgar. Still, Lepanto had planted the seed of that revolution. It proved that artillery and firepower could decide the outcome of battles at sea, not just numbers or courage. The lessons were clear. Innovation could shatter even the mightiest traditions. Unity, though fragile, could triumph against overwhelming odds. And leadership, true leadership, could inspire men to achieve the impossible. Don Juan's courage at 24 had unified veteran admirals under a single command. His decision to place the galleasses at the front line, though risky, had changed the course of the battle. It showed that daring and vision mattered as much as experience. But Lepanto's legacy went beyond its immediate aftermath. It didn't bring the conquest of Constantinople or the end of Ottoman power. Instead, it brought something subtler, a lasting psychological balance between East and West, a rebirth of European confidence, and a new era of technological evolution. Among those who fought that day was Miguel de Cervantes, the future author of Don Quixote. Gravely ill but determined, he called Lepanto the greatest occasion the ages have seen. For him and many others, it was the defining moment of their lives, a turning point in history that closed one era and began another. Lepanto was the last great galley battle in the Mediterranean, the final echo of a tradition stretching back to Salamis, to the Romans, to Byzantium. As the sun set that October day in 1571, over waters stained red and ships torn apart, both victors and vanquished understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary. It was not just a battle of fleets, but of civilizations, a clash between tradition and innovation. The true secret weapon of Lepanto wasn't merely the Venetian galleasses, it was the idea they embodied, that the future belongs to those who adapt, to those who think differently. From that day forward, warfare would never be the same. When Spain's Armada met the English fleet in 1588, the roles were reversed. The English, with faster ships and superior artillery, applied the very principles born at Lepanto. 2 centuries later, Nelson would carry them to perfection. And as technology evolved, from sails to steam, from torpedoes to aircraft carriers, the lesson remained unchanged. Innovation decides the future. More than 450 years later, Lepanto still echoes through history. The victory helped define the balance of power between Europe and the Ottoman Empire. It restored Europe's confidence and, indirectly, fueled the age of exploration and global dominance. Yet every empire involved has since fallen. The Ottomans dissolved after World War I. Spain lost its empire long ago. Venice became a relic of its own grandeur. But the lessons of Lepanto endure. Innovation defeats tradition. Unity overcomes division. And faith in a cause, in purpose, in vision, can turn the tide of history. As the waves of the Gulf of Patras rolled that day, Don Juan raised the crucifix before battle. His men prayed. Priests offered absolution. Across Europe, Pope Pius knelt in gratitude when news of victory reached Rome. For those who lived in that age, this was more than a military triumph. It was divine providence made manifest. Centuries may have passed, but the message remains timeless. Courage, unity, and the willingness to embrace change can overcome even the most impossible odds. This is the story of Lepanto, the day when innovation defeated tradition, when the old world met the new, and when faith and courage together changed the course of history forever.